very good evening. You're watching Plain Speak with me, Akanksha Swaroop. We are coming live to you from the CNN News 18 and Federal Bank Prime Time studio. Today is a big day because Prime Minister Modi is in Italy for the 50th session of G7. Interestingly, it is Prime Minister Modi's first foreign visit as India's Prime Minister for a third time. Issues like the Russia-Ukraine war, the Israel-Hamas war, climate change and migrations will also dominate the summit. But also pertinent to consider is why this summit presents India with encouraging prospects. More importantly, this participation continues Modi's template of his previous two tenures, that of expanding India's outreach to lesser explored frontiers, this time the Mediterranean and the Africa, while carrying forward the character of New Delhi's earlier foreign policy initiatives as well. That includes a consistent engagement with the West, especially the United States and Europe. Unlike in the Cold War in the 20th century, India is now stronger, better placed to engage and shape the outcomes in the unfolding economic, political and technological storms unleashed by great power conflict. The world, in turn, expects proactive Indian diplomacy on the great global issues of the day. And so on Plain Speak today, we tell you why India matters to G7. On that note, let's also tell you Prime Minister Modi, in fact, interacting over there with the Italian Prime Minister Meloni. Very heartwarming visual coming straight from the summit over there with this interaction. Remember, this is one of the most significant bilaterals that is currently underway in Italy. And as we all know, Prime Minister Meloni is also the hostess of the G7 summit this time around. But as far as Italy and India's bilateral engagement is concerned, we've seen only an uptick. And as far as the bilateral relationship is concerned, it's only been growing in the past couple of years. We've also seen how Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, in fact, made two visits to India. We've seen this bilateral relationship only blossom further. Let's quickly bring in Sanjay. Sanjay, what will be on the table and on the agenda when you talk about Prime Minister's interaction with the Italian Prime Minister?
Well, politically, this is very significant. Prime Minister Meloni is about the only European leader, the only EU leader who is on a high given the recent elections. Everyone else has been on a slide downwards, and that has made her a very influential voice within Europe, not just within the European Union. And therefore, a good relationship between Prime Minister Meloni and PM Modi and good relations between Italy and India can politically be quite supportive of India's position in Europe. And this is a very strong wicket to be in bilaterally. That said, not a great deal is happening between India and Italy economically as of now. Trade is fairly low. The growth has not been dramatic, nor has the level of investment been great. That could potentially follow the growing warmth and the greater communication and the increased exchanges, but that is really something to look forward to. There's a point beyond which leaders cannot make that happen. They can offer facilitation or take the lead in inviting business, but finally that will be down to business.
Absolutely. Not to forget how crucial the role of Italy is when you look at the Mediterranean. And Mediterranean is one region where India is also hoping to expand its outreach. And when it is about India expanding its outreach with the Mediterranean, how significant is going to be the role of Italy?
Well, Italy is the key player in the Mediterranean. It is really at the front receiving end of a lot of illegal migration, and that is a prime issue. That is a prime political issue in Europe. We have seen the election results being shaped by that decision, the existence of Brothers of Italy, and it stands for a right-wing policy on migration as categorized, but also quite centrist. Meloni hasn't done anything wild. There was some talk earlier of a naval blockade in the Mediterranean to stop illegal migration. That is not what we have seen in the seas. She is taking a pragmatic approach and seeking through that to win over more people and factions within Italy and also more widely within the EU. So we are seeing Meloni quite well positioned to take a lead in the Mediterranean for all of the EU, particularly on the issue of migration. And to that extent, given that key role that Italy is playing, a role that is getting stronger by the day, good relations between India and Italy and exchanges that may follow on the Mediterranean can only be advantageous to India.
All right. In fact, my last question with you is going to be about how the Prime Minister, in fact, interacted with the Italian Prime Minister at the COP28 summit in Abu Dhabi last year. How will this now be a step forward as far as their engagement at G7 is concerned? Not to forget that the Italian Prime Minister also visited the country last year twice.
Well, this has been a growing exchange between the two. We saw Prime Minister Meloni visiting India. It was in March of last year. Then she was in India for the G20. She has spoken of Prime Minister Modi as the world's most loved leader. So clearly there's a great deal of warmth between these two prime ministers. The fact is that that is a personal relationship that has to spill over politically into tangible results, and that consequence is not necessarily automatic or immediate. So the challenge really will be how this warmth of personal relationships, how this personal rapport between the two leaders can translate into very much more happening on the ground. Politically, yes, but also economically, because without strong economic ties, close political ties are not necessarily going to be correspondingly strong. The real base for good political relations will come from good economic relations, and that is the tough one, that is the challenge, that is where even prime ministers have only a limited role to play.
Many thanks to you, Sanjay, for bringing in all those inputs. And with that, let me also introduce our guests today. I'm joined in by Shivam Chabra, who's a spokesperson for the BJP. Kamru Chaudhary, who is the political analyst, backs the Congress party as well. Rajiv Dogra, who's a former diplomat. And Swasti Rao, who's an associate fellow at the IDSA. Many thanks to you, Swasti, and the gentleman for joining in. In fact, if I could bring in Ambassador Rajiv Dogra. Ambassador, heartwarming visuals. We were talking about the personal camaraderie that the Prime Minister and the Italian Prime Minister share. How will this now translate onto paper, especially if one were to weigh in the consistent engagements we've seen between Italy and India last year as well?
Well, I think the heartwarming part started with messages of namaste to other European colleagues by the Prime Minister of Italy. So the message is loud and clear that here are two leaders who gelled together, who met a couple of times in the past 1 year, and who feel that there are a number of things on which they seem to hold similar or nearly similar views. You mentioned about immigration. I think here it is important to make one distinction, that Italy is concerned about immigration from Africa. It is not concerned about immigration from India, because Indian immigrants have over the years, starting with 1980s, in fact I was just telling another channel just a moment back that when I went on my first posting to Italy in 80s, there were all of 300 Indian nationals in Italy. When I went second time as ambassador, I inquired and found out, we made a survey, and there were 100,000 Indian nationals. So that is amazing progression. Those Indian nationals came in mainly from Punjab in the 80s, late 80s, mid 80s to late 80s. And they started in a very poor manner in terms of being farm laborers.
All right.
Over the years, they have worked hard, and today 50% of Italian cheese and ham is made by those hands, and they own some of that industry also. So there is strength, and there is a distinction between Indian immigration and other immigration, because these are largely law-abiding citizens who have assimilated well and have been appreciated for their hard work.
And that is something perhaps even Italy acknowledges. Swasti Rao, if I could bring you in, we've seen India now hoping to galvanize its engagement with the Mediterranean, the Africas as well. But when you talk about our engagement with the Mediterranean, could Italy be a gateway to other countries as well? Because remember, during the Nehruvian era, there was also emphasis on our relationship with Egypt, something that is not as actively seen, even though the Prime Minister made a visit to Egypt. But what about Spain? What about Greece? What about Cyprus? Could Italy be that stepping stone in terms of India's entry into the Mediterranean?
Right. So a very good evening to you, Akanksha. And yes, India's Mediterranean strategy. Discussion on how Rome is attempting to position itself to serve as a gateway into European markets for natural gas from Africa. Okay, and before the G to have this larger, European outreach into tapping the natural gas markets out there, and then getting it back into Europe, because you know that the Russian war in Ukraine has sort of made Europe diversify away from Russia, and they're constantly in search for new forms of energy security. So that is something why you see that Africa is being mentioned again and again. Mediterranean has been mentioned again and again. And looking at it from India's perspective, I'll just try and connect the dots for you. Looking at it from India's perspective, while of course connectivity is one important thing that we are doing with the Europeans, with the Middle Eastern and the Europeans anyway. Let's see, it is also contingent upon when normalcy returns to Middle East. So of course, that's another topic. But the other dot that we can connect is that Italy and countries like France and Italy, who have had a long presence in Africa, perhaps do not enjoy the same kind of reputational advantage anymore because of their colonial past. Actually, when you look at it from India's perspective, and just giving you an example, that India and France, for example, have a dialogue on Africa. Similarly, I think the time is right for India and Italy to have a dialogue on Africa. Why? Because it is a form of triangular cooperation that India is ideally positioned to enter into. What is a triangular cooperation? Triangular cooperation ideally is a cooperation of two players into a third country, which is a win-win situation for everybody. So India brings the kind of credibility and reputation as a leader of the global South, and also as somebody who champions the causes of the global South, and the Western partners bring the kind of money that is required for these developmental projects. And of course, green energy, the transition to greener energies, and also a lot of other things. Look at the International Solar Alliance, France and India coming together for some African countries. So I basically am connecting the dots for you to let you better understand how cooperating on regions like Africa, which are such important regions in the world today.
Those are a host of very interesting points that you've made. Politically, let me also bring in Shivam Chhabra at the moment. Shivam, there's a lot of chatter over here about how this is Prime Minister's first visit under Modi 3.0. What kind of a fillip can we now expect by Prime Minister's presence at G7, considering the focus on India's foreign policy is now going to be on continuity instead of a fresh reboot?
See, Akanksha, as rightly pointed out by Dogra sir in the previous argument, Namaste has, given a lot of a very loud and clear message to the international fraternity. And I think the G7 summit that is going on, it is a great opportunity for India to probably continue the kind of ties that has maintained with other 7 countries for past so many years now. And I think it is the victory of the Indian diplomacy. I would also say that, we've always believed in human-centric approach. As Prime Minister rightly sent it out while he met Zelensky. I mean, when the entire world was at war zone, it was the Indian Tiranga which was flying high and flying with a lot of, people used to probably bend down when they used to see the Tiranga. So that is the victory of the Indian diplomacy. And I think under Prime Minister Modi ji's leadership for past 2 terms, and I think Modi 3.0, as we rightly pointed out, we continue to ensure that the Indian diplomacy continues to fly high. And I think we always have believed in maintaining best relationship with every country for that matter. And we still aim to do so in the G7 summit that is going on.
Kamru Chaudhary, do you see Prime Minister's presence at the G7 also as a test of Indian diplomacy, considering the US President has talked about how democracies can make a difference when it comes to the war in Ukraine? The West has been consistently aiding. This time around also, there will be assistance given to Ukraine worth $50 billion, that too by unfreezing the Russian assets that the West is currently holding. Having said that, how will India manage this diplomatic tightrope walking, considering it will be next month that Prime Minister will also be part of the SCO, where he hopes to engage with Beijing and Moscow as well?
Yeah, basically, you see, as an Indian, I also feel proud along with all of you out here that India is being part of such a global club, rather, I will say G7 or G20 or the Asian or the SAARC summits and all these things. These are basically a forum for bilateral agreements between respective countries. Like we have seen our Prime Minister meeting different heads of the country states. But basically, the point that I want to drive out here is whether India is strategically important for the G7 countries or not, or is it being used as a pawn to the to pivot a global South challenge that is being faced by the Western countries from China? That is the moot question out here, because our trade deficit with China is over $100 billion as of now. But what is the trade imbalance with the European countries? We are in a very negligible trade position with the European countries. The moment Russia was expelled from the G7 in 2014, till date, India had a very important role to play in the geopolitical situation of the world, be it in the Gulf or be it in the Russia-Ukraine war. But India, under the leadership of Prime Minister Narendra Modi, somehow I feel has not been able to fully exploit the changing geopolitical situation around the world, and could not become a fulcrum for economic activity in the world that we have seen out here. Otherwise, whether Japan is using India as a pivot against China, or whether the European countries are using, that needs to be seen.
All right.
But our trade relations with Russia is a big problem for Ukraine and ultimately the Western world.
No, I don't agree when you talk about trade relations with Russia, considering we've heard how the External Affairs Minister has, stood his ground, especially when it comes to, in fact, energy transactions with Russia. But I'm going to bring in Swasti. Swasti, that's a very interesting point that has been made right now. Having said that, there's a lot of focus on our strategic partnerships when it comes to the West, especially the United States, even France, when it comes to defense deals. But what about trade? And remember, the timing is very lucrative, considering the West is, in fact, engaged in a trade war with China. How can India hope to milk it better, especially when it comes to shifting a part of manufacturing, something we've already seen with how West wants to increase that dependency in terms of manufacturing. But you have a Vietnam, you have a Bangladesh, you have a Cambodia over there to challenge India when it comes to reducing that manufacturing dependency on China.
Right. So very quickly about India's outlook, to the global situation when it comes to maximizing its returns to, in getting more embedded in the global supply chains, etc. Now, very quickly, one is a phenomena which is known as China plus one diversification, which I guess is what you're referring to. Yes, exactly. China plus one diversification is a very good window for India to attract the investments and the foreign direct investment, which are no longer going to China. The catch is that except for the Apple story, we don't really have a success story,
yes,
so far. And one of the reasons why we don't have it is because there are certain things that are coming in the way of it. Of course, on the one hand, we can keep continuing our comparison with countries like Vietnam. It is also true that Vietnam gives a lot of freebies that India is very reluctant to give, given the size and scale and the skill, that Indian workforce has. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there are certain changes that the Indian government has been doing very, very seriously when it comes to attracting those investments, right? And there are production-linked incentive schemes. There are also things of improving our infrastructural development and all sorts of things. And those things have already started, Akanksha. The thing is that they might take a little time to show, because we are a democratic country and we take our own time to come up. And the right thing that the government is doing is that the government is not rushing with these things. Having said that, my suggestion and my take would be that we need to sort of become more serious about it. Yes, there is a geopolitical moment that we can genuinely exploit to the best of our interests, and that will come from getting the investments that are not going to China anymore. That's the one part. The second part is to also retain this multi-aligned economic worldview, and therein I think it is important to be reiterated that our relationship with China, our relationship with Russia has of course changed. It is evolving from being the biggest weapon supplier. Now we are getting all oil from Russia. Having said that, and this is something which we have been very successful in convincing the West also, that it is completely in our interest. Now, very quickly, the kind of challenges that lie therein is that along with the oil trade that has ballooned, so has the trade deficit ballooned. And we need to constantly evolve our mechanisms with Russia. There are problems with the rupee-ruble mechanism system, also because the ruble continues to be a very difficult currency to convert, right?
But Swasti, when you talk about Russia, there's still forward movement. There is always scope to iron out the differences when it comes to the leaderships of both the nations. But I'm going to quickly bring in Ambassador Dogra. We have a lot of talking points over here to discuss. Ambassador Dogra, the other crucial bone of contention when it comes to our engagement, especially with Europe, is concerned, is the FTA agreement as far as India and the United Kingdom are concerned. Years of negotiations, 14 rounds of negotiation, and yet no breakthrough has been achieved. What's disheartening is to in fact see the Prime Minister, who's an incoming Prime Minister, in fact take up the FTA issue again with an outgoing Prime Minister in Britain. How much is now going to change if a Labour Party in fact comes in as well, even if it is to talk about greater market access, issues like the visa, security issues, which continue to be hurdles as far as the overall FTA is concerned?
Well, the key word which you used was how much of it is going to change if a new government comes in, Labour in this case. Well, nothing is going to change very much just because an election has taken place and a new government and a new leader has come in, because the main instruments of determining the policy of a government do not change. The bureaucracy remains the same, the national interests remain the same, and that is where the divergences are between UK and India in this case. The second thing is it necessary that we must have a paper that is signed and sealed when it does not favor, let's say, India or UK? We can live with a paper that is not there so long as there is a desire to increase the relationship, the trade relationship, economic relationship, or investment relationship. I'll give you a historical example. 2000 years back, Pliny, one of the great leaders of Italy, a philosopher, writer, and so on, he said Italy is going to go bankrupt if we keep on importing silk and spices in this quantity from India. And he was not exaggerating. We were exporting so much to Italy that there was real fear that its treasury would go empty. So that meant that India was a major trade partner with Italy or with Rome at that point of time. That can be duplicated even now. The important point is that our businessmen and our industrialists have to take over and take the initiative, just like their counterparts in Europe have to do, to give meaningful push to the trade relationship. It can't just be left to the government.
Yes.
Because governments are not in the business of actually doing the trade business. The second example, again from a comment you made about Mr. Nehru, Pandit Nehru and Egypt, the circumstances were different because diplomacy reacts to circumstances. Then Egypt, like India, was an important pillar of the non-aligned movement. So there had to be greater interaction between those two countries, India and Egypt in this case, and their leadership. Both leaders were tall in their stature internationally. The second important point, which we don't appreciate that much, was the position of Egypt in the Islamic world at that point of time. Saudi Arabia was no not in picture at all. It was Egypt, which was the center of the Islamic world.
All right.
So the relationship had to be there between India and Egypt.
You're right. Priorities change with changing times as well. But Ambassador, as far as placing mechanisms is concerned, that is always the job of the interlocutors. But I'm going to bring in Shivam Chhabra as far as the FTA issue is concerned. Shivam, the Prime Minister has always addressed or referred to as to the UK Prime Minister as the Damad to Bharat. This is what he's in fact referred to him as. But the question that comes to mind is that if we could not sort of iron out our differences with a Prime Minister like Rishi Sunak, how much will India be able to manage if there's a change of governance in Britain?
Asha, the talks are still on, and I think I'm hopeful that the breakthrough is going to come out, and we should not be feeling so guilt about being, not talking too much to our damad. I mean, I still feel the diplomacy of the Indian diplomacy is still stronger to, mend ways and then find out a breakthrough to it. And I think, as rightly pointed out by the co-panelists, I must say that, the Indian diplomacy has gone ways beyond. I mean, you could realize the fact, the kind of export and import that has gone through for the past, I think, 10 years or so, with the countries like the United Kingdom, with France. And I think change of business hub from China to India. I mean, all these top
I mean, that change is still in the process. It would be fairly nascent and too early to say that India's already become a manufacturing hub. We are in the process. Baby steps are still happening.
Absolutely. I certainly respect what you're saying. But again, that process is still on. We've always built in and we've always banked on the fact that we believe in Make in India. That is what we are trying to get the best of the best companies from the world and ask them to build, manufacture in India so that it generates the employment. It adds on to the GDP. It adds on to the net profit, the incomes of this our countrymen. So the thinking is right. The process is on. And I think we should all hope that whatever breakthrough needs to be done, that should be done ASAP.
All right.
So that the
point
benefit
taken.
can be
Kamru
taken out.
Chaudhary, I'm running short of time. Kamru, if I could bring you in. This particular G7 summit for the Prime Minister holds special significance, not only because it's his first foreign visit after he was sworn in as the Prime Minister for a third time, not to forget the fact that it was India that hosted G20 last year. There's also going to be a synergy of what was achieved at G20 vis-a-vis now at G7. Don't you think that India will be bringing much to the table when it comes to what emerges out of the summit this year?
Yeah, Akanksha, very important discussion. You must understand the relationship between India and the Western countries is considerably characterized by a paradox as of now. Why I say this paradox? The country's rise has caused both sides to increasingly share geostrategic interest, like trade relations between India, Europe, its political situation with the Gulf or in the Russia, Ukraine, or its relationship with Canada's present Prime Minister, for example, or the strategic interest that India provides to the Western world against China. That's the important point that we need to be discussed. Where does India stand itself? Because the shared interest that you are quoting out here comes as a paradox. Why I say this? When you go into the main ideals that the G7 has been formed with, like democracy, human rights, free and fair trade, environmental protection, peace and security, these are all the 5 pillars which the G7 stands in, and in which India is scoring very low, either it will be the democracy index or in the human rights criteria. There is a conflict of interest here.
I'll leave the closing thoughts to Swasti. In fact, Swasti, I'd like you to share your closing thoughts on those points that have been made by Kamru. The fact of the matter remains that India has been regarded as the leading voice of the global south. There is no questioning of that aspect. How does Prime Minister now take this forward? Is it time to now also explore uncharted territories like the Africas, where we are already seeing a presence of Moscow and Beijing, like the Mediterraneans, as we discussed earlier in the show? How can Prime Minister now make his leadership and India's leadership visible at the summit?
So very quickly, I know you want me to conclude, and there's not so much time, but I would the first thing is, which is the most obvious iteration, which is that India championing the causes of the global South, the climate financing, always having this fight on, where the global South stands for phasing down of fossil fuels and not phasing out of fossil fuels. Also, getting
all right, I'm so sorry to interrupt you there, Swasti. In fact, live visuals coming in of Prime Minister Modi, in fact, interacting with the Pope. This was a meeting that also happened a couple of years ago, but indeed, historic visuals coming over there of Prime Minister being very warmly greeted by Pope over there. Remember, Pope is also expected to share his views and insights on the role that AI is currently playing. Prime Minister, in fact, sharing a bear hug over there with Pope. And remember, this is indeed going to be a historic visual, because we all know the role that currently Rome is playing as far as EU is concerned. Let me, in fact, quickly go back to Swasti. Swasti, please go ahead and round up on what you were saying. All right, so those are the latest visuals that we are bringing to you. Let's quickly bring in Ambassador Dogra, who continues to stay with us. Ambassador, I think Pope's own presence is deeply symbolic, considering he is also going to share his views on the role that AI is currently playing, not just in terms of elections, but war propaganda and in terms of technology overall.
Well, Pope is concerned from a human angle. He's not talking in terms of manual labor versus technology, but the effect that artificial intelligence could have on policy making and decisions that leaders take. So his is a limited but very worrying articulation of what could happen in future. But beyond that, Pope is also the religious representative of 1 billion plus people, largely in the West, but also in other parts of the world. So in that sense, his presence there and his meeting with the Prime Minister has an importance that is more than the usual courtesy calls on the Pope or by the Pope. The other thing is, it comes at a time when religious heads of whatever denomination stand for peace, unlike the political heads, let's say Biden, who authorizes Ukraine to send missiles given by America deep into the Russian territory. So a Pope or a Shankaracharya would never encourage that or permit that. So there is a difference between a meeting of political leaders and a meeting of a
But you know, Ambassador, what interestingly stands out is also that this is the first time that Pope is part of a summit, especially the G7. So that is what makes it equally even more historic.
Well, he is not a part of the summit. But like Prime Minister Modi
nobody
and others,
has seen Pope
like
make an appearance at a summit. I'm sure you'll agree with that, Ambassador. And that is why when he talks about the role that AI is playing, he's also calling for greater guardrails when it comes to the role of AI.
Technically, he is not part of the original G7 summit, which has already taken place. He is one of the invitees to the G7 summit.
But he's the first Pope to be participating in summit discussions. And that's what makes it equally historic, to be participating in summit discussions.
Because of the circumstances, but whether he will have a determining role in even that participation is open to doubt.
All right, so those historic visuals, in fact, coming in of Pope Francis over there being greeted by Prime Minister. Remember, it was in 2021 that Prime Minister Modi had his last interaction with Pope Francis. But as we were talking about why this is extremely significant as far as Pope's own participation is concerned, he will be talking about the role that AI is playing, something that we've also discussed over there. This is to highlight, he is the first Pope, in fact, to participate in summit discussions. Of course, he is not part of the overall summit, but he will be participating in the discussions as well. The leaders are holding a final day of talks at the annual summit today on Friday, and Pope Francis putting in his historic presence over here, and Prime Minister being greeted over there very actively. Let's talk about how G7 also stands out at the moment when you talk about the role that artificial intelligence is particularly playing in the overall political climate as well. Ambassador Dogra.
Well, that's a very, very important question which is engaging all the right-thinking people, including the makers of artificial intelligence, be it Musk or be it leaders, whether it is in America or in India, that how do you regulate artificial intelligence in such a way that it does not harm the society, it does not injure the mankind, but it comes in as a tool which is at the service of mankind. Now, that is a big distinction, whether artificial intelligence is going to become the master or the server of humankind. Now, should there be rules in place? Can there be rules in place? Can there be rogue elements who will not respect any rules? That's the dilemma which has not been found a solution to so far by anyone in terms of the present day leadership. So I think if G7 is engaged and concerned about it, and G7's guests are concerned about it, it's a welcome development. But to expect quick results is not being realistic. The second thing which we must understand is that we should not hype up our expectations from this particular G7 summit, because the leadership of G7, the original G7, is mostly Germany. Again, the president is on the losing side of the public opinion.
Absolutely. For now, the focus is also on AI, as we all know that Pope Francis himself has in fact been victimized by AI, considering there was a viral photo of him some days ago that went viral of him being seen in a puffer jacket. We'll have to see what kind of guardrails does the G7 in fact come up with, considering they've been bestowed with the task of spearheading the role of AI in today's day and age. Many thanks to you, Ambassador Dogra, for so eloquently breaking down this entire summit for us. And with that, in fact, it's time to slip into a quick break. But coming up after a short break on Plain Speak are rumblings in Maharashtra NDA alliance. We'll tell you all about it, but in just a bit.